I suspect that next to the Lord's Prayer, the Decalogue is probably one of the best known parts of the Bible. Yet, despite being considered especially important, it's widely misunderstood. At the heart of this misunderstanding lies the issue of how we should view the Decalogue. How should we classify the Ten Commandments? Are they laws, as is widely assumed, or something else? And as statements attributed to God, are they universal or particular? Should the whole of society be expected to conform to them, or were they intended only for the ancient Israelites as God's chosen people? This is a complex topic, and much has been written about the Decalogue. I fear that I may be stepping where angels dare to tread. In an enlightening study on the use of the Decalogue in England from AD 1485 to 1625, John Willis highlights three distinctive ways in which it was viewed during this period. He describes these as the civil, evangelical, and practical offices of the law. By these he means, first, that the Decalogue was understood to be God's law for all of society. It was assumed that every society should adopt the Decalogue for its own good. Secondly, by the evangelical office, Willis points to how the Decalogue was used to convict of sin and hence to show the need for salvation. The Decalogue showed sinners that they could not meet God's standard of righteousness. Thirdly, by the practical office, Willis observes how the Decalogue was used to shape Christian piety by defining, in his words, comprehensively and in brief, the praxis of the true Christian. These different uses of the Decalogue in the 16th century England highlight the importance attributed to it at that time, creating a legacy that continues to the present. These uses also prompt various questions. Should we think of the Decalogue as law? Are all of these uses still appropriate? To answer these questions, let me begin by making two general points, which I will then support through detailed observations. And for convenience, I'm going to follow the reformed numbering of the commandments. Point number one, the Decalogue is unique. Within the Pentateuch, it is clearly distinguished from other divine speeches delivered to the Israelites at Mount Sinai. The Decalogue stands apart. Secondly, the Decalogue, in my opinion, is not portrayed in the Pentateuch as a series of laws intended for use in the Israelites' judicial processes. Rather, as we shall see, it is a set of moral values that function as covenant obligations. This distinction between laws and covenant obligations has an important bearing on how we should evaluate the Decalogue. So, as to the uniqueness of the Ten Commandments, we should note firstly that the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy unambiguously state that they alone are spoken directly by God to the whole nation of Israel. Other divine speeches are mediated to the people through Moses. But with the Decalogue, Moses does not act as an intermediary. The fact that God himself announces the Ten Commandments to the Israelites signals their special status. As we shall see, this direct communication is very much in keeping with the portrayal of the Decalogue as a series of covenant obligations. The Decalogue stands at the heart of the unique relationship that Yahweh establishes with the Israelites at Mount Sinai. Secondly, of all the divine speeches recorded in the Pentateuch, only the text of the Decalogue is inscribed on stone tablets by the finger of God. In all other instances, Moses is responsible for recording what Yahweh says. Underlining the importance of the Decalogue, the stone tablets are placed inside the gold-plated chest that sits in the most holy place. This chest serves as the footstool of the divine throne. The significance of the stone tablets is highlighted in chapters 31 to 34 of Exodus, when they are broken and then replaced, symbolizing the breaking and renewal of the covenant relationship. Thirdly, the Decalogue is distinguished from other divine speeches in the Pentateuch by its use of the unique phrase, I am the Lord your God, in English, but in Hebrew it's Anochi Adonai Elohecha. This phrase not only introduces the Decalogue, but also reappears a few sentences later within the Decalogue. There are two notable aspects to this statement of identity. Firstly, the phrase uses Anoki for the personal pronoun I. This form of the pronoun comes 359 times in the Old Testament. A shorter form, Ani, occurs 875 times. Despite the frequent occurrence of both forms of the pronoun, there are only 4 occurrences of Anoki Adonai, I am Yahweh, in the entire Pentateuch, all coming in the 2 versions of the Decalogue. In marked contrast to the very limited use of Anochi Adonai, a shorter form, Ani Adonai, occurs 58 times in the Pentateuch. Secondly, building on this, the 4 occurrences of Anochi Adonai in the Pentateuch are always followed by the word Elohecha, your God, the possessive pronoun being singular. This makes the phrase Anochi Adonai Elohecha a distinctive hallmark of the Pentateuch. Elsewhere in the Pentateuch, the frequently occurring Ani Adonai is always followed by Elohechem, your God, using the plural form of the possessive pronoun. Any ancient Israelite hearing the phrase Anochi Adonai Elohecha would almost inevitably associate it with the Decalogue. It is the hallmark of the 10 Commandments. The use of this phrase, I am the Lord your God, draws attention to another important and noteworthy feature of the Decalogue. The 10 Commandments are formulated in the second person singular, addressing each Israelite individually. The Decalogue has a strong relational character. The initial section, verses 2 to 6, uses the first person, I, my, me, with reference to Yahweh. And the addressees are mentioned throughout in the second person singular, you, your. This style of presentation distinguishes the Decalogue significantly from ancient Near Eastern legal collections, where laws are almost always framed in the third person, with some variation between singular and plural. Even in Exodus, this distinction is evident when we compare the Decalogue with the case laws that are recorded in chapters 21 and 22. Unfortunately, some modern discussions of the Decalogue read too much into the use of the second person masculine singular. David Kleins exemplifies this when he extrapolates from the Decalogue that the person addressed is, and I quote, an individual, a male, an Israelite, employed, a house owner, married, old enough to have working children, but young enough to have living parents, living in a city, wealthy enough to possess an ox and an ass and slaves, important enough to be called to give evidence in a lawsuit. Kleins is not alone in restricting the addressees of the Decalogue to particular Israelites. John Sawyer views the addressees as, and I quote, city dwellers, property owners, and adult males. Along similar lines, Daniel Block assumes that the Decalogue was addressed to individual adult male heads of households. However, there is no reason to assume that every statement in the Decalogue was instantly relevant to each person addressed. And as the late Alan Millard points out in response to such claims, and I quote, any ancient Israelite settlement had gates. The English word city is quite inappropriate to translate Hebrew ear in the majority of cases. Even the poorest might have something covetable, and the masculine you in such commands is the simplest grammatical form, which does not exclude the feminine. So the laws are not restricted in the way supposed. Millard's final point is important. The use of the second masculine singular represents the simplest grammatical form and does not exclude women as addressees. Had the Decalogue been worded to address both genders separately, it would have resulted in an exceptionally complicated formulation that would have doubled its length. While advocates of a restrictive reading of the Decalogue appeal in part to the wording of the prohibition against coveting your neighbor's wife, in all likelihood, a female listener would have automatically adapted what Yahweh said by substituting neighbor's husband. In identifying those addressed in the Decalogue, we should not overlook the fact that the surrounding narrative conveys the strong impression that Yahweh's speech was addressed to all the Israelites, both men and women. Exodus 20, verse 18, begins by noting that Kol Ha'am, all the people, witnessed the theophany and expressed fear because God had spoken to them. No attempt is made by the Exodus narrator to restrict the scope of the Decalogue to a particular group or gender. In both the Exodus narrative and Moses' recounting of these events in Deuteronomy, everything points to God addressing men and women alike. To insist that only selected men are addressed in the Decalogue runs counter to how ancient Israelites would have interpreted this material. We must guard against introducing modern sensitivities into the interpretation of a text that was composed in a very different cultural context. Recognizing that the words of the Decalogue are formulated concisely using the simplest grammatical form, we should also note the significance of Yahweh addressing each member of the Israelite community personally. To quote Moshe Weinfeld, as Philo points out, when rules are addressed to the group as a whole, an individual can evade responsibility by hiding himself in the crowd. But when he is addressed personally, there is no escape. The personal nature of the speech is very much in keeping with the making of a covenant that centers on establishing a special relationship between Yahweh and each Israelite. The relational dimension of the Decalogue is very important and underlines, I think, that the Ten Commandments were not composed as laws. A further reason for rejecting the idea that the Ten Commandments are laws is the absence of specific punishments. A comparison of the Decalogue with the case laws in Exodus 21 and 22 quickly reveals that they are formulated in very different styles. Whereas the case laws specify appropriate punishments for different offenses, no punishments are listed for the Ten Commandments. Although the second and fifth commandments appear to include penalties, these are probably best understood as motivation clauses intended to encourage adherence to divine instructions. There's good reason to think that the case laws in Exodus 21 and 22 were designed to guide laymen serving as arbiters of disputes in a society without professional law enforcement officials. While the case laws are not comprehensive, they cover a range of situations that might prove useful in adjudicating similar, though not necessarily identical cases. Lacking punishments, the Ten Commandments must serve a different function than case laws. A further reason against viewing the Ten Commandments as laws concerns the way in which they are designated in the Pentateuch. It's commonly noted that they are labeled in Exodus 34, verse 28, the 10 words. It is an exceptionally bland way of describing them. However, according to Exodus 34, verse 28, what God inscribed on the stone tablets was the words of the covenant, Divrei Haberit. Similarly, in Deuteronomy 4, verse 13, Moses recalls that when God declared his covenant to the Israelites, he commanded them to keep the 10 words. Moses later speaks of the tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant. These statements clearly associate the Decalogue with the concept of covenant. The stone tablets are also described in Exodus 31, verse 18, as being the two tablets of the Edut. I'll explain this word in a minute. Due to the influence of the Vulgate, which translates Edut as testimonium, Some English versions adopt the translation testimony. Alternative translations of edut are covenant law, NIV, pact, or covenant. Significantly, the noun edut comes 20 times in Exodus 25 to 40, always with reference to the 10 Commandments. The 2 stone tablets are referred to as the tablets of the edut. A few verses speak of the edut being placed in the golden chest in the most holy place. Consequently, the chest is regularly designated as the chest of the edut. Even the tabernacle is called the dwelling of the edut. These numerous mentions make edut the most common designation for the Decalogue. Yet, remarkably, this is largely ignored in assessing what they are. According to Daniel Block, the translation of edut as testimony is, quoting, misleading, because we usually think of testimony as the utterances of a witness in a court of law or some less formal context. Block proposes that the singular term edut should be rendered pact and the plural form edot as contractual obligations, covenant stipulations. Understood in this way, the term edut is almost synonymous with berit, covenant. The designation edut fits well with the narrative context of Exodus 20. Importantly, by designating the Decalogue as a covenant, berit, or pact, edut, the Pentateuch clearly distinguishes it from materials that are referred to as hukim, regulations, or mishpatim, case laws. Another significant factor suggests that the 10 Commandments should not be viewed as laws, intended for use within the legal system of ancient Israel. When the 10 words are compared with similar statements in the rest of the Pentateuch, they are consistently formulated in the most general and least specific way possible. They are not carefully worded laws that establish a clear boundary between what is legal and what is illegal. They read like general statements of principle. Let me illustrate this with reference to several of the commandments. In the context of the Exodus account of God establishing a covenant relationship with the Israelites, it is hardly surprising that the first word requires exclusive allegiance from each Israelite. You shall have no other gods in my presence. Remarkably, perhaps, this wording is not used elsewhere in the Old Testament. Prohibitions elsewhere in the Pentateuch concerning other deities are expressed using more specific language. Words like recall or invoke, go after, serve, worship, bow down, speak in the name of, turn to. As Gerhard von Rad observes, the wording of the first word is the most general and least detailed of all the versions. Regardless of how we might interpret the first commandment, the concept of having other gods before Yahweh is broad in scope. There is no place for other deities within the life of the Israelite community. The fifth word instructs the Israelites to honor their parents. Once again, the wording is intentionally broad. Through their attitudes and actions, individuals must show proper respect to both father and mother. Honoring one's parents involves more than obedience. According to Brevard Childs, to honor is to prize highly, to show respect, to glorify and exalt. It is akin to worship. Compared to the case laws in Exodus 21, which focus on striking or cursing one's father or mother, the Decalogue instruction is much more demanding in what it requires. As these examples illustrate, the Ten Commandments are expressed as broad principles rather than as specific or precise laws. This has a major bearing on how we should interpret them. When we read the Decalogue as laws, we quickly run into all sorts of problems because they lack precision. Laws must be specific to be usable. The statement, "Don't drive too fast," would not make a good law. We need to set precise speed limits to create workable laws. The principle, "Don't drive too fast," is exceptionally important, but it is largely useless as a law. The Ten Commandments resemble general statements of principle rather than laws. One more feature, and with this I'll finish on this part of my talk. One more feature strongly suggests that it was not regarded, the Decalogue was not regarded as a collection of laws. This concerns the last commandment, which prohibits coveting. This final word addresses an aspect of human behavior that on its own could never be regulated by a court of law. No court could legitimately punish a person for merely desiring something belonging to another. To circumvent this problem, Johannes Hermann proposed in 1927 that the verb chamad denotes not merely coveting, but also appropriation. Understood in this way, the 10th word, like every other commandment, addresses an observable action and does not simply refer to an inner disposition. A significant corollary of Hermann's approach is to reinterpret the 8th commandment, lo tignov, you shall not steal. Rather than referring to stealing in general, it was proposed that it prohibited kidnapping. While some scholars have embraced the idea that chamad denotes an act of misappropriation, others highlight the evidence in favor of retaining the traditional understanding of chamad. Bernard Jackson argues convincingly that there is no reason to assume that the 10th commandment requires an action so that a human court could apply a sanction. Noting the absence of any punishments in the Decalogue, Jackson proposes that God himself is responsible for enforcement. Supporting Jackson's position, Moshe Weinfeld comments, "There is no justification for challenging the traditional interpretation of lo tachmod as lust and intention. The verb chamad by itself does not connote taking or appropriating." When we take these distinctive characteristics into account, it is apparent that the 10 Commandments stand apart from other materials in the Pentateuch and have a special place in Israel's tradition. The Decalogue is described as Yahweh's covenant or pact. which he announced directly to each Israelite. The Decalogue consists not of laws, but of moral values that were to be the basis of God's covenant with Israel. They are not formulated for use in legal settings. They lack precision, go beyond a human court's ability to judge. No punishments are listed because, as broad principles, they cover a wide range of circumstances that require different penalties. As a short list of broad moral values, the commandments were intended to shape the life of ancient Israel as God's holy nation. Concise and memorable, they are not designed to be comprehensive, covering every area of life. Nor do they unpack every aspect of each moral value. The commandment against killing does not distinguish between different types of homicide. Importantly, these moral values provide a definitive statement of the obligations an individual must fulfill to be part of the covenant community. The Decalogue is, in the words of Daniel Block, a covenant document rather than a legal code. According to Brevard Childs, anyone breaking these commandments would set himself outside the established life of God's people. Given its uniqueness in the Pentateuch and its purpose in shaping the nation of Israel as the people of God, it is hardly surprising that the Decalogue has held a special place in the catechisms and architecture of the Christian Church. From 13th century onwards, there is evidence of remarkable growth in the use of the Decalogue for Christian instruction. This increases dramatically with the Reformation in the 16th century. In the introduction to his larger catechism, Martin Luther wrote, "It is a fact that anyone familiar with the Ten Commandments is, in consequence, familiar with the Scriptures as a whole. He is able in all affairs and emergencies to counsel, to help, to comfort, and to come to an understanding and decision, whether the subject is temporal or spiritual. He is qualified to sit in judgment upon all doctrines, estates, spirits, and laws, and everything else in the world." To illustrate this claim, Luther adds, "What is the whole Psalter but thoughts and spiritual exercises based on the first commandment?" Like Luther, other reformers adopted a similar outlook regarding the importance of the Decalogue. John Calvin remarks in his Institutes of the Christian Religion that the Ten Commandments, and I quote, "contain a complete rule of life." In an introduction to a collection of essays on the Ten Commandments, edited by Carl Bratton and Christopher Seitz, Philip Turner states, "Without exception, the reformers took the Decalogue to be a written expression from the hand of God of the law of nature, written also by the hand of God upon the human heart." In the eyes of the reformers, the Decalogue was given to the Israelites so that they would, in the words of Turner, know and follow what God in his wisdom had in creation made the law of all persons. Viewed in this way, the Decalogue was universal, relevant to everyone in every age. However, by associating the Decalogue with natural law, The reformers ascribe to it a status and significance that does not sit comfortably with its presentation in the Pentateuch. While the idea of the Decalogue as universal law has a long history and many supporters, there are grounds to adopt a more nuanced understanding of the Ten Commandments. Firstly, in the Pentateuch, as we've noted, the Decalogue is referred to as the covenant or pact God made with the Israelites. It stands at the heart of the special relationship that is established at Mount Sinai. As covenant obligations, the Ten Commandments are not laws, but broad moral values. Importantly, the Decalogue is addressed to those whom God has already redeemed, and among whom he will come and graciously dwell. This situates the Decalogue in a specific historical context, pertaining to a particular group of people. We should not, therefore, automatically assume that the Ten Commandments are universal laws, even if we may perceive many or all of them as reflecting important moral values. The Decalogue is not legislation, despite being frequently described as law. Secondly, from a Christian perspective, we must recognize that the Decalogue is central to a covenant that the author of Hebrews describes as the first or old covenant. This covenant is replaced by a new or second covenant that is superior to the first. According to Hebrews 8, verse 6, Jesus is the mediator of a better covenant. This development should make us cautious in our appraisal of the Decalogue. For the Christian, the old covenant is replaced by a new and better one. In line with this, we might anticipate that the obligations of the old covenant would no longer be directly applicable to the followers of Jesus. This appears to be the case regarding Sabbath observance. In the book of Exodus, the Sabbath is presented as the sign of the covenant made at Mount Sinai. Strikingly, like circumcision and the food laws, the Sabbath is not presented in the New Testament as a binding requirement for the followers of Jesus. Is this merely a coincidence? Or does it suggest that the early church did not perceive the keeping of the Sabbath to be a universal requirement? Here I walk on eggshells, for I know that Christian attitudes towards Sabbath observance vary considerably. In Colossians 2, verses 16 and 17, the Apostle Paul writes, "Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ." Commenting on this passage, Douglas Moo concludes, and I quote, "In a way similar to Romans 14, verse 5, Colossians 2:16 can validly be used, we think, to conclude that the observance of a Sabbath day is no longer a requirement of God's people in the new realm." Interestingly, writing about the Sabbath, Philip Alexander states, "Martin Luther and John Calvin were both adamant that for Christians the commandment to observe the Sabbath had been abrogated." On this, much more could be said, but unfortunately, time does not permit me to expand. In the context of the first covenant, the Decalogue provides guidance on how to live as God's people. While it retains something of this purpose as part of the God-inspired scriptures, we should be sensitive to how we communicate its moral values to others, both believers and non-believers. The Decalogue belongs to the Old Covenant, but this covenant has been replaced by a new and better one. In his teaching, Jesus affirmed the moral values of the Decalogue, understanding them as broad principles. Importantly, he demonstrated the need to communicate these moral values not as laws by which behavior might be judged and regulated. In his criticism of the Pharisees, Jesus vehemently rejected religious legalism. In marked contrast, he advocated that his followers should adopt wholesome attitudes and behavior out of love for God and love for others. In conclusion, how we view the Ten Commandments matters. I would humbly suggest that we should not misread them as universal laws, but as the essential obligations of the Old Covenant. As such, they have an important place in God's redemptive plan, but we must be careful not to exaggerate their significance or misrepresent their true nature. Thank you very much.
Well, it's not so much of a as a question. It's just like that really stood out to me and caught my attention when you made that note of not just, of course, that God wrote these commands as that it was actually really a covenant, and that there are no punishments assigned to it. I kind of went off on a tangent with that. I was like, I've never realized. I mean, I knew it on one way, and then it broke it out, of course, later, which you went through so beautifully. But I really appreciate just seeing that afresh, because I went right over that for a long time. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for that comment.
Thank you.
I started by thanking you, Desmond, Desi, for very
Call me Desi, please. Yes.
Provocative and detailed paper, and wondering if I might ask the million-dollar question as to exactly what you mean by God writing the Decalogue, or God's finger directly on the tablet, because you assume we're talking obviously within a specific plausibility framework here. I understand that, but I try to write outside the plausibility structure, and I get into a load of trouble for doing it, for implying that I believe that God actually wrote the Ten Commandments. Now, you're a scholar who deals with these things all the time. How do you defend what is regarded as patently absurd by those outside our framework?
Well, if you believe in a God who can do anything, then there is no reason why God could not be responsible for inscribing on what were blank tablets that Moses took up the mountain, the text that he then brings down.
Yes, but I think that's a cop-out, you see. If we're having to try and live within a world that does not have this plausibility structure, we're trying to witness into this world as thinkers about God. And it's not going to work just to say, you've got to believe in God in order to talk to me about this.
Well, it strikes me you run into all kinds of problems, because you have God descending onto the summit of Mount Sinai and speaking verbally to the people, and the narrative describes their reaction. So, and in chapter 24, the men, some of the elders of the Israelites go up the mountain, and there is a comment that states that they saw God and that they were able to observe what it was like under his feet in terms of him being on the mountain. So that there is a sense in which, as in other passages in the Old Testament, God can make himself known, sometimes in what would appear to be physical form, but you also have then theophanies where he also makes himself known. And I see no problem in terms of taking seriously the appearance of God and the actions of God. If you start to read the book of Exodus and begin to exclude the possibility that God in some way acts in this world, then what do you do with all the supernatural events that are described in the opening chapters, the early chapters, the crossing of the sea? That there is so much in Exodus that requires the concept of God being physically present, or being present in a way that is obvious to the people. There's hardly and when you come on, there's hardly a chapter in the book that doesn't presuppose in some way the active involvement of God in this world. And that comes to a head with the creation of the tabernacle.
It is indicative of the tragic nature of our era that it's not possible to talk about these things to an unbelieving journalist who is very interested in religion.
Okay. Well, I think we've got to still take seriously what the text has to say, and as a witness to God, his nature, his being, and someone has got, there's a sense in which one has to hope that the Holy Spirit will prompt someone to begin to see that these things actually are possible.
Thank you. Yes, that's lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, no, and Desi, if I can just come in on that. So I know a bit more about the context of Jenny's question, which is very interesting. And the thing that we have to retrieve as Christians, which I think mainstream biblical scholarship and evangelical scholarship is in danger of losing, is special divine action. And so the context that Jenny is referring to is, where one gets lampooned for the notion that God writes. And I think the apologetic response to that is the arrogance of people who know that God can't write. So that's the way I would turn it around. Obviously they have a very insightful insight to the nature of God, and such is the nature of God that he can't write. So I think that's the way to turn it around. And this happened to me in Israel. I was in a seminar next to, there were two of us who were Christians and about 25 Jewish scholars. And a postmodern scholar next to me said, "Oh, well, of course God can't speak. He doesn't have a voice box." And so what I would do in my subsequent presentations is have the quotation from the Psalter: "Cannot he who created the ear hear?" So I think this is a real opportunity for apologetics, and one has to turn it around and ask the person, well, you obviously have incredible insight into the nature of God, and you know that God cannot speak and God cannot write. So please explain to me how you know that. And in the process, we retrieve special divine action, I think.
Again, I greatly appreciate Professor Alexander's lecture, but if we're to regard the Decalogue as a set of covenant obligations for the Old Covenant, what do we do when, for example, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7:19, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is anything but the keeping of the commandments of God. Or when he says in 9:21, not that I am without law toward God, but I am under the law of Christ. I know he refers also to the law of Christ in Galatians 6:2. Presumably, those to whom he was writing would not yet have had the Sermon on the Mount to check. And if he's not referring to the Decalogue, to what is he referring?
Okay, good question.
Thank you for the question. I, there is a complexity to the material in the Pentateuch, and which I think we need to appreciate. And one of the problems is that Paul could talk about obeying the commands of God without referring at all, but thinking about the Old Testament at all. He could merely be thinking that God can offer instructions, and we need to respond to those. So I think we've got to be careful that we don't put all of our eggs in one basket and thinking that the Decalogue that's the only thing that is important when it comes to the Old Testament, that it is the all-important thing, and therefore we need to exalt it beyond the position that it has. So I'm not wanting to deny the importance of it in the Old Testament context of the Sinai covenant. But I think we need to appreciate that it's not presented there as law, and therefore how we read it, how we understand it, is going to be influenced by that. And we need to be careful in terms of, I suppose, our application of it. And so I'm I suppose expressing caution about how we come to it. We see it in its original context for what it is, and we can talk about it. We can say, here are the values that God gave as ultimately exceptionally important for ancient Israel. But we need to appreciate that we also want to draw attention to the fact that Christ comes to bring about a new covenant. And we want to focus people on Christ rather than on the law at Mount Sinai. And it's striking for me, for example, in Galatians 3, Paul wants to point to the Old Testament, but when he wants to talk about the gospel, he goes back to Abraham, and he wants to play down the importance of the law that comes later. And there's part of me is in terms of saying, when we understand the Ten Commandments in their original context, then we keep them in perspective. I think the danger is that we have possibly in the church exalted them, given them a greater place than we ought to. Now, that's obviously debatable, and that's what I'm kind of throwing out, at least for the conversation.
Yeah, so,
Well,
yeah, Dennis, you're welcome to
I apologize.
No, do come back in on this. Just an alert that, that this is an exploratory lecture series, so we want to get these on the table for discussion. And we will have later lectures on the Decalogue in the New Testament. So, and Sabbath and all these other things. But Dennis, do respond, yeah.
Right. Yes, I don't want to say too much, and but Professor, alluding to Professor Taylor's question, switching gears a little bit, what do you think of the idea of angelic mediation of the law written with the finger of God? Say around Galatians 3, 3:19 and 20.
Well, okay, but at that point, we're moving beyond the Decalogue.
Well, of course.
Of course. So there's a considerable amount of other material in the Pentateuch that can be brought in under the umbrella term of law, Torah, and we need to appreciate that there are that there's material that falls in under what I would call regulations, hukim. There's mishpatim, case laws. When you get to Deuteronomy, you have Moses delivering a speech to the Israelites, to the second generation of Israelites, that he will refer to as Torah, the book of instruction, but which then gets recorded as the book of instruction. And one of the complexities is that when you come to the New Testament and you have references to law, Torah, nomos, it's difficult at times to know what's actually being picked up from the Old Testament. You can't necessarily assume that when somebody talks about law in the New Testament, that they are referencing the Decalogue in the Old Testament. The point I was trying to bring out was that the terminology that's used for the Decalogue is this term edut. A little thing I had never appreciated before, but when you come to Psalm 119, which is this great celebration of, you might say, the law, the word edot, testimonies, covenant obligations, gets mentioned in nearly every stanza. And it's as if it's being listed alongside mishpatim, hukim. It's as if this was one component that made up, you might say, the Torah. So the Ten Commandments are an element of what's revealed in the Pentateuch, but there's a great deal more. So if I only had the Decalogue, I would not know that ancient Israelites made a distinction between premeditated killing and accidental killing. There are lots of things that don't come out in the Decalogue, and you are dependent upon other material to sharpen our understanding of these moral values.
Unquestionably. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So, Desi, just before I bring Susan in, can I just play devil's advocate for a moment? So you've stressed, as many scholars do, that these are called the 10 words. They're not actually law. And one thing that struck me in working on the Decalogue was at the end of Exodus 20, verse 6, it speaks of those who love me and keep my commandments. And this is the word mishpat.
Mm-hmm.
So you actually have the terminology, one of the words for law, right there in the Decalogue. Now, do you not think that sort of, it kind of, it makes me a bit cautious of drawing a strong distinction between 10 words or principles and the mishpatim?
Okay, but I appreciate very much that point. It's still striking, however, that the terminology that gets used for the Decalogue and the way it gets described is either with berit or edut. And even within what's referred to as the Book of the Covenant, chapters 21 to 23, the mishpatim actually only make up a section of that. They don't make up all of it. So again, I think you could still, in a sense, argue that within the Decalogue, that there's a sense in which this term mishpatim is being used to refer not to the Decalogue itself, but to other material. There's a complexity to these things, and I was just trying to bring out something which I think is at least worth considering.
Absolutely. Now, Susan.
And there could be some overlap with those terms too. So my question has to do with going back to the covenant obligations and the idea of the movement from old covenant to new, and Luther's thought about, in some sense, leaving behind for example, the Sabbath. I'm trying to wrap my head around the idea of fulfillment and abolishing. So, Jesus came not to abolish, and I know it says the law, and I'm not sure exactly which of the overlapping terms that would specifically apply to. But this idea of fulfillment, I'm just wondering if there's a way for that to help the chasm not quite be so wide between those who would say, oh, we don't have to do anything with the Sabbath anymore, for example, or yes, it applies to everybody. So the idea of remembrance, for example, is something that I think gets fulfilled in the new covenant, and it's not that remembering is completely left behind. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around the things that you said and the idea of movement from old covenant to new covenant and the idea of fulfillment, perhaps helping me anyway. I'm trying to use that as an idea of how to not have such a stark difference between what was happening under the old covenant and what is happening under the new covenant, and where the Decalogue fits with that. What do you think about the idea of fulfillment fitting into the things that you said?
Okay, that's opening up another massive topic in a sense, because you find that the concept of fulfillment in the eyes of some people will be the fulfillment of promises that are there in the Old Testament. So you have, for example, particularly in the Abrahamic material, you have promises that relate to the coming of a future king who will bring God's blessing to the nations. And Christ is the one who fulfills that. And you could argue that when Matthew is writing, or when Jesus speaks in the Sermon on the Mount about fulfilling the law and the prophets, he is not actually thinking so much about fulfillment of what we would think of as legislation, laws, the Decalogue as such, but rather thinking about the fulfillment of these promises that are such an important part of the Pentateuch itself. And so you move from the Old Testament making promises that come to fulfillment in Christ. There's a sense in which the Old Testament looks forward to the coming of the Messiah, and this concept of fulfillment seems to me to fit in with that. Mm-hmm. Now, you can also speak about fulfilling laws, and again, another observation I make is that it's really interesting that the king in the Old Testament was expected to make for himself a copy of the Torah of Moses and to be familiar with it. It's interesting that when Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, the quotations that he offers, or the quotations that he draws upon, are all from Deuteronomy. It's as if he is, in a sense, looking to fulfill or drawing on the instructions of the Old Testament that were there for the king. So there are, in a sense, different levels, different ways in which we can talk about fulfillment and its use. So there's a complexity to it. And I'm not sure that you can simply tie it down to the idea that laws in the Old Testament in some way get fulfilled in the New Testament. What I'm trying to get across is that there is, you encounter in the Old Testament the idea of God making a covenant with a special group of people. You come to the New Testament, there is a greater, a better covenant made that embraces all nations. And we need to appreciate the dynamics of that movement from the Old Testament to the New Testament.
And would you say that that umbrella could include, for example, the New Testament people of God? I would see a fulfillment in the way I worship God is in Christ. So there's a fulfillment in the first commandment, if you will, that I can worship God in spirit and in truth because of Christ. I can honor my parents because of Christ. I remember the Sabbath in the remembrance of the Lord's Supper in Christ. So I guess I might not have said it quite right. The fulfillment of the moral obligations is in Christ, and in that way, there's a continuity. Anyway, so that's where my brain was going.
There is continuity, but also there's a sense in which you've got to appreciate that you are moving from a very specific covenant with Israel. And within that context, the Sabbath was a sign of the covenant. And when you come through to the New Testament, the Sabbath no longer retains the importance that it had for the early church. And you've got to, in some way, work out, how do I address this particular issue if I see the Ten Commandments as being universally applicable to every community, every person. I'm trying to say that I think we've got to appreciate that the Ten Commandments are not presented in Exodus as universal. They are set in a particular context. They are not law, so it's not helpful to speak of them as natural law or to use that kind of terminology, because it, I think, becomes misleading. And so our handling of the Decalogue has to be sensitive to these factors so that we instruct Christians correctly about the material. Paul said that all scripture is God-inspired and useful. So I'm not wanting to say that the Decalogue has no use. It's just how we use it that we need to get our head around.
Thank you.
I don't know what I'm going to do about my Reformed Presbyterian Covenanter background and our love of the Sabbath day. But it's going to make my husband happy. Some more freedom here. This is just a fresh and exciting perspective to me for talking to others about the Ten Commandments. And as I think about writing this book for people in the church, have you had some interesting conversations with others talking about them being a moral value thing instead of laws that do not do these things? I'm just wondering about some of the conversations you've had with people who are not believing Christians about this.
I can't say that I've had those kind of conversations. In a sense, they've not come up naturally.
Okay.
Okay, but I do know that I sense. I grew up in a culture in the north of Ireland that had a very strong attachment to keeping the Sabbath.
Yes, me too.
And that has changed. That has changed over the decades considerably. And I think one of the it comes up, you might say, in the public arena, because you then have Christians who will be quoting the Ten Commandments for wanting to restrain what happens on the Sabbath. And I'm not convinced that that is apologetically the best approach towards looking to convey how a Christian should, first of all, understand what the Ten Commandments are about, and then also how this relates to living in Christ.
Right. Yes, that's where I was going with it. So I think it's a new way to be talking about it. And I'm just, I'll be interested.
Like I grew up in Sunday school and was taught that the shorter catechism, and you have in the shorter catechism the Ten Commandments being expounded to you, and statements about how the Sabbath should be kept.
Right.
And it came across very much as if this is something that is essential. It's you've got to take this very, very seriously. And I'm not sure that that's how I should have been educated within the church.
I agree. Thank you.
I'm trying to get some ducks in a row in my head, trying to amalgamate different voices, I guess. When I hear you, Professor Alexander, on covenant, I in my head I hear moral burden, the moral burden of the commandments, the implicit moral worth of the Decalogue, which I think is what Libby was just referring to. I hear Jesus saying, I come not to change one jot nor tittle of the law. Now, I don't know what word he's using there because I don't have the languages. And I hear Melanie Phillips, a very famous Jewish journalist in Britain, saying that the values underpinning our civilization, she said it yesterday at this conference, are the Jewish law, the Jewish values mediated through Christianity. Now, crumbs, what on earth she meant by that, I don't know, but I think it represents a shift in her thinking, where she sees a lot of Christianity as successionist and very anti-Jewish. So Jesus is not wanting to change, not coming to change one jot nor tittle of the law. Are the jots and the tittles subsumed within the Decalogue? Is all the Pentateuch and all the case studies, in a sense, carried within by this massive moral vehicle, which is the Decalogue, and which does underpin our civilization and does come out of vast barbarism and everything that went before this axial moment in civilization's long story. We need in a sense, a bigger frame, perhaps, to talk about these things. Does any of that resonate with you?
Yes, it does resonate with me, but it's not to. I want to be able to say that the Decalogue is significant. It's a concise statement of moral values that God communicates to people whom he has already redeemed. It's so they are not expected to keep these in order to gain salvation, but it is a reflection of their love for God, and they are given in the context of a relationship. I think we want to get away from the idea that the Decalogue, in some ways, is objective law. But what the Decalogue is about is actually a relationship with God.
Right.
Jesus will make the same point when he says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. I think the relational dimension is something that gets lost in the discussion of the Decalogue.
Thank you.
That was one of the things that I wanted to, in some way, bring out, that we need to appreciate that these are obligations that God is placing upon people because he has already done something wonderful for them. And it is out of a response of love that they are meant to actually embrace these as a way of life. Now, I, as a Christian, will Jesus, that's what Jesus is saying, in a sense, to me as well, that the new covenant is about loving God. It's about loving my neighbor. These are the values that are there in the Decalogue. All that I'm trying to do is to be cautious about how we articulate these values that are implicit, that are there in the Decalogue. If we come to the Decalogue and see it as law, we end up debating whether the commandment is to murder or to kill.
Yes.
What are we to make of ratzach? If we see it as a broad principle that we should not kill, but not as a law, then our interpretation of it can actually be much more, it can embrace much more than if we have to narrow it down to deciding between what's legal and what's illegal.
That's very helpful indeed.
Yes, I am aware of the time. Okay, so wonderful introduction on so many levels, and I would love to see a Clip Notes version for all of this. Just to synthesize this, because my background is apologetics, and my Van Tilian mind of presuppositional versus critical reasoning and everything like that is totally validated in this. Thank you so much. And yet, at the same time, I am working on a series as an artist for the liturgical year, and I've been looking at Sabbath and contemplating this, and it's all about wonder. And so this question, so I know that we're unpacking this, and there's a lot more, and for time, but there's kind of so as far as like feedback, I would love a little bit more clarification on those, especially those that are very liturgical driven, really finding our grounding and our rootedness in the creative week of God, and finding our whole sense of time and rhythm as it has been revealed over time in scripture, and just for us as humans. I would love to hear more about that when you have time. Thanks.
Okay, that's going to take me outside the Decalogue. Is that what you intend?
Well, I mean, since we're arguing, I'll just say, just since it's, for example, just this very specific thing on Sabbath and the idea of liturgy and time, that would be great. But not now.
Okay.
Yeah, so Alexandra, that's great. And I mean, I think, Desi, you've raised a whole lot of issues. So if I may, we are over time, but perhaps I can have the last question. So I think, Desi, you've encouraged us, which is really important, to look forward. Okay, I think on this question of universality and particularity, it may be particularly important to look backwards. And the reason I say that is my approach to the Decalogue is that the one who gives the Decalogue is not just the Yahweh who saved the Israelites from Egypt. He's the creator God. So he's the creator, redeemer God. And it's that, I think, that enables Old Testament, ancient Near Eastern Israel to be a royal priesthood and a holy nation at a particular time and a particular place. So, and I think once the very strong link with creation is brought in, you have a window into the paradigmatic universality of Old Testament law as Chris Wright would express it. And if I may just, the one thing, so the Sabbath intrigues me a lot, because the Decalogue in Exodus anchors the Sabbath in creation, not just in covenant, not just in, and I mean, I was reading Tom Wright recently on this. He really struggles with this because Paul hardly refers to the Sabbath in the New Testament. But so I think where you get at the universality of the Decalogue is, this is what, the nations have got to be able to look into the window of Israel and say, oh my goodness. So that's what real human life looks like at a particular time and a particular place. So I think creation, so this would be my question. If you look backwards and not just forwards, do you not emerge with a stronger sense of the universality of the Decalogue?
Yeah, yes. I think you can. Okay. It's interesting from the little bit of reading that I've done about the reception history, and that's not my field of expertise, but I get a sense that the reformers, in a sense, saw the Decalogue as taking them back to natural law and creation, But they also then were prepared to argue that in terms of what's in the Decalogue, the Sabbath is a kind of peculiar element. It's not a reflection. In some ways, it's an element that's there for the Jews, but not there for the church, because they were reflecting then on the New Testament and the way that the Sabbath does not enjoy the significance that it has. You move from the Sabbath to the Lord's Day. You have something happening in the early church regarding this. There's no idea of keeping the seventh day, which is very much the creation aspect. And there's there's an alternative approach adopted towards unpacking this. Now, I have reservations because in my reading of the Pentateuch, it seems to me that when the Israelites are on their way from Egypt to Mount Sinai, they have to be taught to keep the Sabbath. So when you read the instructions that are given in association with the giving of the manna, and the impression I have is that prior to that, Sabbath observance was not part of their culture. They didn't grasp the significance of gathering twice as much on the sixth day. They had to be instructed as to the significance of that. So the connection with creation, in a sense, I think is significant. How we unpack it, I think is up for debate. I'm not sure that in itself is sufficient to build an argument that what you have in the Decalogue is natural law that goes back. You see, I'm unhappy with the term law, as you'll appreciate it. And are these moral values that go back to creation? Well, of course they do. But that still raises the question, particularly to do with the Sabbath, I think, because of how under the new covenant, it does seem to be played down. So there's I appreciate there's a complexity, and the reception history of the Decalogue reflects something of this tension that is there between thinking of them as universal, but yet appreciating that there may be one of them that doesn't appear to be universal.
Yeah, and so so everyone is aware, these are big issues that are being put on the table for our discussion. So John Whitty, who gave us a lecture on the reception history and the reformers, was pushing in the direction of natural law. So one thing I would just clarify, I want to push in the direction of universality, but to me that is not the same as natural law. So natural law is stuff that you can simply read off the creation without the illumination of revelation. So I'm not a proponent of natural law. So I think there are distinctions one can make there. Yeah.